My name's Tim O'Neill and I'm the Executive Chair of Exponential here in Australia. The reason we exist is because we need to see more churches being planted across our country. In the 20 years to 2011, we saw the number of Protestant churches across Australia actually decreased by 1,000 churches. Now, at the moment, best estimates are that there's only about 200 new churches a year being planted across Australia, and that's just not enough. We have a vision of working with ministries such as yourselves and the different denominations and networks around the country to see the 200 a year increase to about 1,000 a year within 10 years. Now, we can't do it by ourselves. We can't do it full stop. Obviously, we need God's hand to be involved in this, but also we need the ministries that each one of you are actually actively involved in across this country to not only survive, but to absolutely thrive in this important space of seeing churches planted across Australia. So I'm going to ask each of you to just briefly mention who you are and the ministries that you actually represent.
Yeah, great. I'm Kyllum Lewis. I'm here representing Acts 29. We're a global network that is planting churches that plant churches, but I'm representing Australia, so I'm the Director of Australia here. And yeah, really excited to see what God's doing.
Mark Morley. I work at City to City Australia, and I've been there about 18 months. We do three things as an organisation. We plant new gospel-centred churches, so we train, coach, mentor pastors to do that and fund them and work with them to carry them through that process and beyond. The second thing we do is we strengthen local churches. So we have consultants that work into pastors and leaders, into their lives, into their leadership at a local church level. We seek to build up their ministry, whether that's around evangelism or ministry design or preaching or whatever it looks like. The third thing we do, and it's the really kind of exciting one, sitting around the table with these guys, is we drive movement in local areas. So that means we have locally embedded people that work in their local context to drive kind of gospel networks. And so we think that kind of work really kind of promotes local flourishing of gospel-centred kind of communities and places.
Fantastic.
Yeah. I'm Bree Mills. I do a couple of different things, but predominantly probably Microchurch Australia, which really seeks to encourage microchurch planting, to encourage best practices in microchurches, and really to provide a space for microchurch leaders in Australia to collaborate and to learn from one another, and to really try and embed this as an Australian way of doing church in our context and in our culture. Our heart is to reach the people that most mainstream churches will never reach. So people groups on the margins, and that just the people who would never walk into a church. Like in Australia, there's still a large percentage of people who will walk into a church if the right circumstance happen. But we want to reach the ones that would never walk into a church. And so that's the heart that drives Microchurch Australia. I'm also part of a movement called The Company, which is really about supporting women in church planting. So we run some cohorts to really shape and to form women and to equip them to go out as church planters as well.
That's great.
Awesome.
My name is Amanda. I'm part of the leadership of New Thing Oceania in particular. New Thing is a global non-denominational organisation that helps to plant churches in all sorts of forms, models, methods. And so I guess the main focus for New Thing in particular is to help catalyse or be a catalyst for churches to reproduce churches who reproduce churches who reproduce churches. We don't want to see churches plant one church. We want to see churches reproducing and that multiplication happening in all spaces. So we very much help with the coaching. We help with what's called a movement system, which focuses on multiplication at discipleship, leadership, church, network and movement level. And we also help with networks and connecting people and collaborating around God's mission for us as a church to reach every single nook and cranny of this whole beautiful world.
That's great.
G'day, I'm Scott Saenz. I work with the Reach Australia Network. We're a formed evangelical network that primarily focuses on two things. We want to see new churches launched, new churches reach new people. So we get alongside churches and denominations to provide assessment, coaching and support for the church planting couple and church planter primarily, to see them start a church that, God willing, reaches the lost and grows into a church that can plant more churches. So that's one side of things that we do. We also work with established churches, providing resources to help churches become healthy, evangelistic and multiplying. And so we've got a national conference where we regularly gather with sort of over 300 churches from across Australia. And the desire there is actually, we can do so much more together. We're actually better together. So the opportunity to come together, to learn from each other. But as a network, we actually get alongside each other in some ways. And so the network and the infrastructure behind it is all about actually supporting churches to be getting alongside other churches, to see coaching and development and resourcing with the view to seeing new churches started and the established churches across the country become healthy, vibrant places where we hopefully see new life.
That's great. I'm just so encouraged about seeing so many different facets around the table here. Your organisations, your ministries are all about increasing capacity to see churches planted across different denominations and networks in Australia. And I love what you're doing, and I love the fact that you're taking different approaches, complementary approaches to it. As we've been talking to different leaders amongst networks and denominations around Australia, I've seen a real openness and a real hunger even for the denominations and networks to be able to effectively be involved in church planting. I'd be interested to see if you've seen likewise, but also what particular opportunities do you think lay in front of us at this time in relation to church planting and multiplication? Who's first?
Well, we've just come out of a pandemic which I think shaped, changed, affected the church in ways that we're probably not going to see for the next 12 to 18 months. I think one of the big ways that we're seeing pastors who are tired, who are worn out. And so that's what I think a number of what we're doing is actually providing that coaching and that supporting network that'll hopefully mean pastors actually, stay the course and move past this side of things. Now, my hope through the pandemic was that we'd actually see a number of church closures. I know that sounds doesn't sound like a wise thing, but or a positive thing, but actually I was hoping that it would actually see the ones that are declining and actually not being helpful for church activity. They'd close so that we'd actually see new life birthed in them. Yeah. They become new places of growth, because I don't know why we need to have 100 year anniversary celebration for a church. I think if a church for a time period is actually reaching the lost and seeing people grow in their knowledge and love of Jesus Christ, then that's great. Let's celebrate that. But if they're not doing that, then let's reshape them, re-envisage them, revitalise them so that they can actually do the mission of the church.
Yeah, no, that's great. What about anyone else? Mark, what about yourself? What are you seeing at the moment?
One of the most exciting things I think we're seeing at City to City is the growth of a pipeline of real diversity of planters. I was just looking at our stats today in preparation for this actually, and 40% of our church planter cohort currently and in future are women, which is really encouraging for us actually. It represents, I think, a real quantum shift in leadership in the church that's really welcome at City to City. The other thing that we're seeing is 30% of our new planters are from a non-English speaking background. That's incredibly encouraging. It means that the church is vibrant, it's multiplying in places it hasn't before, and we're able to come alongside leaders in new places where the gospel is either not preached yet, or it's kind of being obscured by language or cultural difference or geography. So just the excitement actually of our hearts around our First Nations ministry as well. We're seeing a lot of Aboriginal church planting and otherwise. And so what I'm seeing, I guess, in response to your question, is just a quantum shift in the pipeline of who is planting, who is called to plant, where they're called to plant, and really kind of as an organisation trying to respond to that. Yeah, it's really exciting.
But that's great. Bree, from the perspective of micro-churches, are you seeing that there's a greater uptake or greater interest in people establishing micro-churches at the moment?
Yeah, it's huge. 10 years ago when we started micro-churches, we thought we were the only ones doing it. We've since learned that there was probably a few others. But in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen an extraordinary explosion of micro-churches. And it's been the gift of the pandemic. I really do believe that when we took kind of gathered church services off the board in the large scale, big event style, we actually forced churches and leaders and even denominational leaders to start rethinking what other tools that they could be using. And I think that was one part of it. The other part that really brought microchurches on the scene was during the pandemic, we actually all learned to reconnect with our neighbours. And we started to reach out and we checked on the people who live next door to us, and we took gifts to our street, and we actually reconnected with the local and with face-to-face people ministry, because while we couldn't go a long way, so we had to stay within our, our 5Ks. And I think it helped the church, like across Australia, reconnect with what they're called to in terms of just literally loving their neighbour, and then doing that in in the context of smaller groups. Yeah.
So tell me, are there many micro churches around Australia these days?
There's a couple hundred that we're aware of floating around Australia. So so there's quite a few, and some of them are in networks that are kind of larger group networks. Yeah. Some of them are in networks of one or two. And most of them are connected to a denomination or a church or some other body that helps to support them or to encourage them or for accountability and things like that. So I think the myth of the solo rogue micro church isn't actually real in Australia.
Yes.
Most of them are actually really quite healthily connected to some network or oversight organisation.
That's good. Kyllum, are you seeing any particular model of churches being planted at the moment?
Not necessarily. I think, I would probably, on the back of what Bree said, I think the pandemic has, as a network, we're really committed to missional innovation, but the pandemic really helped us to think that through. It helped to sort of get our eyes to be thinking through, okay, well, what is the church? How does it function? Yeah. And I think it's opened up the eyes of our people in our congregations to think about ministry and mission and planting in ways that they probably didn't before. So in Acts 29, we had a number of churches that did plant through the pandemic. But even those that didn't are thinking through things in a very different way than what they did 5 years ago. So, and I think that the model is what's probably shifting. So it's thinking through models.
So it's no longer a cookie cutter. This is what we've done in the past.
There's a diversity in approaches and trying to think which is effective. Particularly in our context. And being a global network, we obviously have the influence of Europe and others that kind of we get to speak with and meet with, which is really helpful to get us to think through our context and the degree of Christian faith and what it's like in Australia compared to what it was 20 years ago.
It was a real opportunity to sort of stop and pause and think through what is church about, what are the fundamentals, also to stop you had permission to stop a whole bunch of stuff without upsetting people because you were forced to, and it was the government or someone else saying it and not you.
And just think through other ways.
Think through what you then restart on the way back, which I think is great.
So we've seen a lot of that, I think, throughout our network.
Yeah, that's great. Amanda, with coaching and ongoing support for church planters, learning communities, that type of thing, are you seeing that there's a hunger for that at the moment?
Absolutely. So like sort of what Scott was saying at the very start, I think with the Great Resignation and with a great number of pastors sort of moving on, some welcomed to, others, we grieve the loss of, and all of them we celebrate obviously the time that they've been able to contribute and the legacy that they have left that we now get to build on. But I do also think that with that comes the great collaboration. We've actually got this beautiful opportunity to collaborate. People are thinking a lot more about kingdom rather than castle. People are really thinking outside of the box. People are thinking about their neighbourhoods and who else lives in the neighbourhood, who else is doing things in their neighbourhood. They're not just thinking, I'm going to be the first to pioneer this new space, but actually taking time to do the research, to ask a few more questions, take a bit more interest and leading out of that space of collaboration.
No, that's great. And Scott, I know you've got a real passion, a real interest in seeing church planters being coached, but tell us about the necessity that you see about coaching and mentoring the spouses as well.
Yeah, well, in church planting, there's a sort of spousal cooperation is one of the sort of Ridley's 13 key things. Is the spouse on board with a plan? And so I think often that's a role that's misunderstood. It's a role that's not valued, and I think as we've seen the decline in the church, we've seen denominations spend less and less resource and time inputting into the marriage and inputting into the spouse, and it's such a key part of the spiritual life of our churches, encouraging and honouring marriages in our churches. We've always invested in the marriages of our planters, but also we've been working on our established church leaders as well. I think it's something we're passionate about. We want to see coaching happen as well for the team, the team member as well. So that'll be another shift we're moving into. But Coaching, having someone regularly keep you accountable, cheer you on, get alongside you is just something that's really important, and I think increases the effectiveness, the missional effectiveness, and also the effectiveness health-wise of the leader as well. Yeah. And it's such a rich thing as well for the coach. Like our network is a network of volunteer coaches, so most of our coaches will coach 1 or 2 or 3 church leaders outside of their denominational networks, outside of their states as well. And they all speak, our coaches all speak of the richness that brings to their own ministry, the opportunity to sort of learn and sow back. So, we're as a network, we really, want to keep valuing that richness and diversity that we get from coaching.
Yeah, that's great. Kyllum, I've got a question for yourself and I'd like to throw open to the others as well, but it picks up on what you said a moment ago. Now, COVID, of course, brought about a massive disruption, didn't it? A massive disruption to church life. And the models of churches being planted are in many cases different to the churches that have been around in the past. I've heard it said that after that disruption of COVID, we must ensure that the new normal is not the same as the old normal, but rather things must change. Yeah. Can you tell me any ways in which you're seeing new churches, the new that's being planted, changing to be different to the old?
Yeah, I would say, like, particularly now, it's an interesting thing because there's a strategy element to that I think we can talk about, but I think there's a spiritual dependency thing that I think has really shifted. So I feel like a lot of our churches throughout Australia have gone, we've been relying on ourselves and our strategy, which is important, and those things need to be thought through. We need to increase our prayer, our dependence upon the Holy Spirit, and actually start. So I think that's been primarily one of the biggest shifts. And then out of that is then coming, okay, well, how do we do certain things and what are the approaches that we take?
Yeah, and I think there's a rediscovery actually of highly contextualised mission in the local context, right? Tim Keller often talks, it's one of his key theses that actually a church needs to be built for the context of which it finds itself, or the context which it's seeking to reach. And I think that's helped during this pandemic. What you've seen actually is a hyper-localisation of the local church. Wonderful. More expressions that are smaller, bespoke. We try and train church planters, church leaders to think about their context, to sit in it, to marinate in it, and to consider what God would have for them. And so what we have as a result is not a network of kind of church in a box type approach, but a kind of approach that says, well, what's God calling you to here? How can you reach the lost in your context? How can you honour Jesus as King in the place that you find yourself? So that's been a really kind of key learning out of COVID that I think will only kind of grow over time.
And I'd also say with that, I feel like COVID has really exposed churches' lack of ability to be able to actually disciple. That's become a very apparent need, is to actually be disciples who make disciples. And so I think the method, the means that take shape, there's a lot more embracing of various forms of that. It's the focus and the drawing back to our main call is to be disciples who make disciples, and whatever that takes shape of, I think is a lot more accepted and embraced, as long as you're doing that you're focusing on that Jesus mission, that call to neighbourhood.
Particularly as a lot of people have seen like the church attendance decline because of COVID. That's caused a lot of people to ask, well, what are we doing? How well have we been going at making disciples? And so I would say that and evangelism for us is what I'm seeing going up, is getting, like what you're saying, getting back into communities and going, we're not here to put on a church service for Christians. We're here to reach people that don't yet know Jesus so we can make disciples who can make disciples and eventually plant churches that can plant churches.
That's right.
And I think that's a dynamic shift that we're seeing, which is so exciting.
And the reality is that churches won't be planted unless there's multiplication happening at the discipleship and leadership levels. So we all want that, have that heart to see church multiplication happen, but we need to make sure we go back to the basics of ensuring and supporting and fostering the discipleship multiplication and the leadership multiplication.
And one of the things I think the pandemic afforded some churches, so I know some churches found it really heavy and they got involved in like loads of online and kind of got over busy. Other churches actually pared back and went deep on they simplified and they actually focused on the discipleship. And I think you see in the Australian church these two kind of different paths coming out of COVID. One is the exhausted, burnt out pastors who try to do everything and keep everything the same as it was online. And the others who, like I was talking to a church pastor the other day, who they kind of shut down their services. They rostered all their staff to go visit certain people and literally do discipleship in one-on-one and one-on-twos based on where they lived. And they've seen tremendous growth in their church. So I think the problem, I think, is that we're coming out of COVID with two different approaches. And there are some pastors who are exhausted and churches that are struggling and the people aren't coming back. And there are some churches that are loving it, that almost don't want to come back on Sundays, and they're growing and they're flourishing. And we have to hold that both of these stories are a part of the Australian church.
Yeah. And you saw the benefit of the body, like churches that invested in raising up leaders, in building teams, that weren't the sort of, solo pastor. There was a real strength there, even though a lot of the time during the pandemic, you can only have 2 or 3 or 4 people, in a room. I think we did see a whole bunch of other people get into new roles of serving, and but the churches that paid attention, I think, to building teams and handing over responsibility to the whole church, it will come out stronger and better able to continue to reproduce.
And I think we're seeing that in the Australian church. I think we're seeing that kind of releasing of the priesthood of all believers a bit more than we used to. It's not down to the one ordained or particularly commissioned person, but we're actually starting to see the kind of greater release, not just in our kind of Pentecostal charismatic churches, even in some of our more mainline denominations, where people are being released to go and actually do what God is calling them to do, wherever God has placed them to be. And I think that is going to be a game changer. Yeah. If we get that in the Australian church, that every believer is called to be on mission and a part of what God's doing in the world, and that I think will really change the fabric of Australia.
I'm sure many around the table talk to denominational leaders all the time, like we do, but also, one of the key drivers of that, and it's unrelated to COVID actually, is the significant number of vacant pulpits in our country across mainstream and other Protestant denominations. That's been fascinating, and actually equipping lay leaders like Reach Australia does with their lay leadership program as well. Is I reckon going to be a critical way that we're going to be able to kind of
we've got
raise leaders.
We've got to keep teaching our leaders to be developers. And discipleship is development. And we have all these opportunities in the life of church to be growing people in their godliness, but also growing people in their ability to serve and love the body and be the church in those local communities. So I think again, it's been hard getting people back into a lot of ministry roles. It's been hard to wind back in. But again, what it's forced us to do is we've now got to be intentional. We can't just pull out the roster and assume that people are going to turn up. Because I think that's been one of the big shifts. Regularity of attendance in churches is a lot less now. It's gone from probably 65% of the time to 50%. Also, just the regularity of going around to people's homes and doing hospitality. I think through the pandemic that took a massive shift. As a family, we're only just starting to get people back in the house and doing dinner and all those sorts of things. So it seems like just as a culture and society, we've retreated into our homes and having people back in them has been harder and harder to do. And we've appreciated not having that business, I think, as well. So I think there's been, again, they're profound cultural shifts that we're going to see, I think, in the next 12 to 18 months play out.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think just picking up on some of the conversation just here, one of the problems that we face in Australia is a lack of church planters or prospective church planters going through leadership pipelines. I know when I planted a church many years ago, I thought, who me? Because I wasn't qualified, I wasn't eligible, all of these things. And there must be a lot of people out there at the moment who have a similar question. It's a bit like Moses in Exodus chapter 3, who am I, Lord? And what would you say to someone like that who has a bit of a stirring in their heart, but they don't feel qualified or equipped? Where can they go? Can they go to your ministries, for example? What would you suggest to them?
I'd suggest first talk to your church leaders. It's the church that raises up and sends out. So talk to those around you. They've seen you in ministry. Now they're hopefully able to help you identify whether you've got the gifts and the skills. I'd say talk to a church planter. Talk to a church planting couple, get into stories and books and read and find out. That should get you excited and engaged. We've got a tool called a church planner assessment tool. Very, very simple, questions that can help you think into your gifts and competencies. And so I think that's kind of a helpful tool that you can kind of go, okay, I'm good in these areas. And what it is just starting a conversation that hopefully helps you then go, okay, well, what might be helpful for me to go and jump in a church plant, get some experience. It might be helpful for me to go and do this ministry role for a bit in order to get prepared. Or actually, I might not be the person, and I reckon that's a good discovery as well. I might not be the person who should plant a church, and that means I can then go be a team member. I can get along and support it. And isn't that? I mean, who wants to be a church planting leader when you can be a church planting launch team member?
That's right.
I think the experience for women who are starting to sense an inkling towards church planting is very different. So my experience with raising up leaders, and that was part of my job for about 10 years, was that lots of men were quite happy to put their hand up and say, yep, I think I could be a church planter, rightly or wrongly so. But to get a woman to put her hand up and say, actually, I think my God might be calling to be a church planter, required about 27 other women to tap her on the shoulder and say, have you ever thought about? And I've just had another conversation like that with another woman this week who is completely gifted for church planting, but I don't know what number voice I am in hers, but I'm not number 27 yet. And so I encourage any woman who has that kind of inkling to actually go find some other women to talk to about it. I understand that there are some churches where women can't explore that calling, and that's okay. But go and find an audience where you can explore that calling and go connect with the company for women in church planting, chat to city, chat to whoever it is that you can get around you, either women you see in leadership, to actually talk through that calling and have some courage, because I've actually seen God use women in Australian church planting in some incredible ways, often in ways that are really well connected to their community, that don't just build a church that is a multiplying, disciple-making church, but a church that is deeply and kind of intricately connected to their community and really loving and serving their community. And I think it's a really powerful witness, but I do think that there's quite a role for current leaders to play in actually pulling that call out of women and encouraging them to step into it, because there just isn't a lot of role models out there for women to follow.
You're exactly right.
Do you think we're also seeing a reluctance for people to step into leadership as well, like with some of the high-profile failures? Do you think there's actually a reluctance to be that the point person and the leader? Because I hear you say, there's loads of blokes putting their hand up and saying, I want to plant a church, but I get the sense there's a lot of people actually saying, no, I don't want that. I've seen my pastor go through it. I've seen the stress on his family and on his marriage relationship. I don't want to do that.
I think it depends what sort of church you're talking about planting. I think if you're asking someone to lead a big, highly mechanistic, systematic church plant, I think a lot of people are backing off and say no thanks. But if you're asking people to lead an embodied local community that's contextualised, that's really seeking to serve their local community, then I think you've got more people who are actually willing and interested, because I actually think it's not even a Christian, it's not unique to Christians, but our Gen Zs and later, they want to make a difference in the world. That's part of who they are. And they believe they can, whether that's because of God's empowering or because of their own abilities that they've been told that they have all their life. They do believe they can make a difference. And I say, let's let them. Give them the space and the rope to actually have a go at doing that.
And just on that, I think there's a theological framing there too that says, well, just as God's Spirit, and it's only His Spirit, can call us to salvation, He also calls us to vocation. And so what I would say, with the discernment, with assessment, with conversations with godly leaders like you, godly leaders in your own language group or your cultural group. Otherwise, the tremendous diversity of the church in Australia means that you can find people who will speak God's vocation into your heart and life.
I would also add to that, anyone that's looking or a little bit hesitant about stepping into a leadership role, whether it be church planting or even just any leadership role within a church, go back to the disciples in the Bible, read the scriptures. They were highly inadequate people, yet they were the ones that started this whole Jesus mission or carried the Jesus mission forward. And so I think that if we just simply strip it back to our DNA, of the 12 disciples, and where the church was actually birthed from was a whole lot of oddballs giving it a go.
Praise
I think
God.
there's a lot in that makes accessibility for all of us, and I often find that the reluctant leaders are actually the best leaders. The people that are hesitant are often the ones that are actually some of the best leaders, and the best at modelling discipleship.
Yeah. There's a few of them in the Bible.
There's plenty of them in the Bible. Yeah, and I would also say there's plenty of great tools, definitely, like the assessment tools and other training out there. I know that with New Thing we have a fivefold movement system, and so going through that allows the option of action and then reflection, and so there's this high accountability but low control as to people responding to their call, their God-given call and their God-given mission, and so. That's what we really want, isn't it? Just people to be obedient to their call of God in their lives, whatever that might look like and whatever shape that might take.
I think people need to realise too, who are starting to discern that it's not, hey, we cut the rope at day one and you're off to church plant. Yep. There is denominations, there is missional movements, there is organisations that will walk with you at every step of the way. Yeah. Yes. Like my hope is that there is no church planter in Australia that is planting alone. Yeah. That everybody, so if you're discerning this and you're like, I'm not sure I can do this, that's probably a really good and godly place to start, because you can't do this, but God can. But also to know that there will be people who will walk with you through that process. And if your denominational group isn't providing those, find them. They exist. They are there. So.
And beyond that, there's networks, isn't there?
Yeah.
There's plenty of networks where people can
100%.
continue that journey with.
Yeah, I was just going to say part of what we do is we have a pretty robust assessment tool that we go through. It's quite robust. It's gone through 10 competencies and different areas are really helpful, but we also do pre-assessment. So there's a chance for a couple to come to, say, a major conference that we do and just meet up with another couple and just talk through, that could be you're 3 years away from planting, but you're just having someone who's starting to journey with you, and so when you're going to major conferences, where it's an Acts 29 conference, whatever it might be, you get to meet some people, you get to sit in rooms with people, you start to then build relationships with people who've already done it, can walk beside you, and they're going to journey with you all the way. And maybe, like you said, Scott, maybe it's like you get to this point, you've gone through the process, you're like, actually, we're not called. It's like, that's actually a great thing, because you would have been sharpened in your faith. You would have been thinking that through. Or, as we've seen, people do get called. So when we planted, we had someone in our church, they went through an assessment with us and then with Acts 29. They started in 2019, pandemic hits. They ask questions of themselves and they're able to go back, well, hang on, we were assessed and others affirmed that and confirmed that and said, no, we do see the gifts, we do see the call, we do see the character. I find that stuff super helpful. And then if you've got coaching, we provide coaching as well along the way. If you've got that sort of stuff, I think because we're quite a humble culture. And so we do have those who are like, I don't know, is it me? Should I? I don't want to put my hand up. To have others alongside you who go, you absolutely should. And how can we help you? Exactly what you're saying. How can we help journey you through? And particularly this next generation who are very, very, they want to make a difference and they can make a difference. So yeah, I find those sorts of tools, conferences, if you get to spaces where church planting is on the lips of people, any of that type of stuff, to expose yourself to what it's realistically like in this particular context. It's not that country over there that's America. It's not that country over there that's Europe. In Europe or whatever, it's Australian, you're hearing Australian stories. I think that really helps.
So just taking this question just a little bit further and going back to when we're talking about we can't afford to let the new normal be the same as the old normal, how much of a disincentive do you think it is to prospective church planters where all they've ever known is a model of church which mightn't be the right model for tomorrow? They look back at the church that they've been in, and perhaps it's a church that's not going well. Perhaps it's a church where the pastor's been burning out or under stress. Perhaps it's a church where, as Bree was saying, talking about coming out of COVID, they've tried to do everything and they're exhausted. And they say, hey, I'm not putting my hand up for that. How important is it that we actually present a different model for what church can be? And how do we do that?
I think the model actually is not the relevant question here. The call is, the competence is, if you take it out of the theological. But essentially, we trust all around the table that the gates of hell won't prevail against the church, actually. And so as an organisation, we're model agnostic. And we think churches are built and grown for their context, that what looks good in Bendigo might not in Surfers Paradise, and the leadership required for that church is going to look different. So I don't think necessarily the model needs to, has to, should change. The model is, of course, Jesus' bride, right? And so I also kind of take those words kind of seriously around how what a model of church should or could look like.
I think the model that we've really got to concentrate on, I think if we want to multiply church planting, then a lot of it's going to come down to how current leaders of churches are modelling their life and leadership.
Yeah.
Like I think if we see, like we've been seeing a whole lot of leadership failures within the church or leaders who are modelling poor behaviour, we're not going to have people put their hand up for church planting. But if we start to see leaders who are modelling humility, who are willing to listen to ideas and things that are coming from their congregation, who are encouraging innovation, and they become the permission givers, the encouragers, the equippers, like I believe they're supposed to be, then I think we're going to have people who go, oh, he's doing such a good job. Like it inspires people to want to join in. So I actually think the role of the lead pastor and the modelling of whoever that person is really, really important for kind of seeing multiplication of church planting.
And I'd even go further to say it's a team. A team model is actually really valuable. We think about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. His prayer for the church, his final prayer for the church was unity. And I think that's our call for us as the church in this next season, is to step into that call and that prayer and actually get on our knees before God and really ask God, how do we go about this? What tools, what methods, what models do we need to, and just embracing all of them, because he didn't ask for uniformity, he asked for unity. And so I think there's the ability for expression around models, methods, means to reach every single person, whatever shape or form they might take.
Yeah,
That's great.
and I think there's a lot of freedom, like currently in our context. I feel like we've kind of moved from the church growth period of time.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we've seen that, we've been in that, and now there is tons of thinking, tons of just people are exploring options. And so to answer your question, I think one of the ways we need to do that is actually kind of signpost other churches that are doing things differently. So one of the great things I love about being in Acts 29, we do a quarterly global prayer meeting. And so we get people from Romania, we get people from Africa, we get people from all tribes, all tongues, telling their stories, we pray for them. But you hear different things of what God is doing through them in their context, in their culture. And it's different from here, but it makes us question and ask. So even in the Australian context, like we might have someone who's in a rural context, we need to hear from them if we're in the urban context. We've got churches in hard places as a collaborative that we do. It's so important to hear from people who are in those lower socioeconomic areas doing church ministry. Those of us in the middle class areas need to hear about that because it actually stimulates us to think, hey, that's really great what you're doing there, So I think there's a lot of we've had top down, this is how you do it. Whereas I think we're starting to go more in that sense of what are you doing? What are you doing? And so I think we need to actually flagship a lot of these ministries and churches within our own churches, within our organisations, because that stimulates thought.
Exactly. And innovation.
And innovation. Yeah.
Scott, do you have anything to
For me, the need's great. So we live in a country where most people don't have a relationship with Jesus. So for me, the gospel is still the only way people are saved. And the gospel is good. We don't deserve grace, but we are given grace, and even more so, God generously wants us as His fellow workers to see churches birthed and churches launched and lives changed and transformed. We get the privilege of actually ministering alongside Him and empowered by His Spirit as well. So for me, it's the need is great. The gospel is not just good; it's very good. And so I'd say, to someone who's sort of thinking out there and questioning, why not, and why, if not you, then who? So
That's great. Yeah, I have one final question that I'd like to ask you all, and that is, if there was one word of encouragement that you might have for church leaders or denominational or network leaders, what would it be? Kyllum, I'll put you on the spot to finish.
I think we've got to start thinking longer term. I think we're too short-term thinking. So we need to be thinking 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, multiple generations from now. What is going to actually have that type of impact rather than just our particular church in this particular time. So that we can not just have churches but have movements. So for me, I think it's a big challenge for us is to think far longer down the road and how do we start creating pipelines that would develop future generational leaders, because some of our best leaders are sitting in our kids' church right now. Some of them haven't even been born yet. And we need to be thinking about how we're going to train and equip those young men and women to be missionaries in our country.
Yeah, just on that, I love the Baptist churches in New South Wales strategic plan called a blended ecology because it has a vision for the year 2050. And so that, again, they're planning long term with a whole range of different church plan strategies. And I think that's very positive, yeah. Who's next?
I think for me, I was just reading the verses from 1 Thessalonians the other day, and the three things that are picked up, one of which is endurance in hope. And I think it's easy to be discouraged. I know looking at the NCLS data or the census data or all of the rest of the data that comes flooding in makes us feel a little bit morose, actually, particularly as Christian leaders. It makes us feel isolated. The recent case, of course, of the Essendon Football Club and City on a Hill makes me pause and think, who are we as religious minorities, etc., in this country? But also, of course, the endurance in hope bit is we trust in a wonderful Saviour and a wonderful God that's given His Son for us. And so the endurance in hope bit is as I said before, the gates of hell won't prevail against the church. And whatever that looks like, and whoever is raised to lead it, I'm pretty confident that we have a hope in Jesus that will never fail.
Yeah, no, that's great. Bree?
It's the simple things for me, but it's like my greatest encouragement, I think, for leaders would be to draw near to Jesus, like to abide in Jesus and to do that not just as a 30 minutes once a day, but a way of life. I think leaders who are abiding in Jesus don't have moral failures, and moral failures do more damage to the church than 10 positive church planting stories do. Leaders just need to, as a first priority, to go deep with Jesus.
Repent and believe the gospel.
Yeah, exactly. And to allow Him to continually shape and form their lives in His likeness. I know that's not a finished work in my life. And I'm guessing it's not a finished work in any leader's life unless you're Jesus. So to be willing and continually open and submitting to that, I actually think that'll be the greatest testimony to the church.
Amen.
Is leaders who are actually starting to look more like Jesus. Graham Hill says of the church in Australia that we're not Christ-like enough and that we're not cruciform. So we don't look like Jesus and we don't serve like Jesus. And I think in some ways he's right. And we really need a revolution of the Australian church to look like Jesus and to serve like Jesus. And I think that would be my biggest encouragement.
That's great, thanks.
Yeah, and I would echo exactly what Bree said. I just think, our doing needs to come out of first being and being in His presence and first being disciples before we go and make disciples. Because who knows what we're going to be replicating if we're not replicating Jesus in our life. And so I think we've got a real responsibility to, run this race with perseverance and endurance and tenacity, but fixed eyes on the prize, and to let the distractions and all the other things in the world that might come and just take our attention away or vie for our attention, but to actually make Jesus our main focal point in everything that we do and outworking of that. And the other thing I would also say is, for me, one of the things I really try and practice and encourage leaders to live out is Micah 6:8, to act justly, to love mercy and to walk humbly. And I think if we as church leaders, we as disciples can first of all live in that and lead out of that posture, we have to be doing something right, have to be doing something positive for the kingdom. So
I'd say clarity. As leaders, you ought to clarify what you ought to be on about. I think Jesus has been really clear in Matthew 28. We ought to be out making disciples. So plan to make mature disciples in ever-increasing numbers. I think it's really simple. Every church has the same mission. It's going to look different. It's going to look different because of your context, because of who you are, because of the people you have the privilege of loving and leading. So clarity around that, and that'll help you say no to a whole bunch of stuff, but it'll hopefully help you have focus on growing and making disciples.
So what I hear around the table is, let's make the main thing the main thing. Let's love Jesus, let's become like him, let's do as he's commanded us to do, which is go and make disciples.
Easy.
Easy, that's right. Off you go, Mark. I think one of the things that encourages me also, and on one hand I look at our nation and my heart breaks for a number of people across our country who just don't know Jesus, and I think our hearts should be broken about this. But also when we look at developing countries around the world, we find that developing countries have probably close on 90% of the Christians in the world, and only about 10 to 11% of the Christians in the world are actually found in Western developed countries. And so when we look at what's happening in Australia or the United States, it's really not the big picture, but not the macro picture. The Holy Spirit is incredibly at work across our globe, across our world, and I think there's an incredible opportunity for us to put reliance back on him again, and to put the cross of Jesus Christ at the forefront again, instead of how we've done church necessarily, and wanting to do what we did yesterday. Pursue him with a passion. Be open to the Spirit's leading, and see there's a massive harvest out there. And just in finishing, I'd just like to finish with Luke chapter 10, where Jesus, he looked at the harvest and he said, the problem's not in the harvest, it's in the workers. Let's pray for workers for the harvest. And I think that's really one of the big issues that we have here in Australia. And then Jesus said, go, I'm sending you. It's simple, go. And we have to be putting courage into the men and women across our country, the courage to go, and then be providing the assistance to actually help them when they go. Because there is a harvest out there. And the harvest needs what we've been entrusted with. So why should we stay here? Men and women, thank you so much for giving your time today. You're amazing people, and the ministries that you represent are all an incredible blessing to our country. What we'll do, so that in case people, for when people want to get in touch with you, they'll be able to find your contact details and details of your ministries on the Exponential Australia website. That's exponential.org.au. And, I trust that there'll be many people who in time will see this video that will make contact because they want exactly the kind of help and encouragement that you can provide. So once again, thank you so very much for participating in this conversation today.